Welcome back to Parking Live, where the curb meets the conversation. I'm Jade Neville.
And I'm at Darst.
There's a story that the parking industry likes to tell about itself, that it's modernizing, that the old ways are being replaced, that technology is finally catching up with the complexity of what cities actually need from their curbs.
I think a lot of that is true, but we continue to see vertical integration, and that's essentially startups working to solve intractable problems for cities, but in the background, they're quietly looking to be acquired. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the rise of vertical integrators concerns me. I'm really looking forward to a discussion about the risks inherent in vertical ownership and the impact on the loss of specialization.
Yeah, and our guest today is Nick Stanton, the managing partner at Athena. Nick has been in the industry for nearly 20 years, and he's seen a lot during that time. And today, he's going to share some of his thoughts on this topic. Nick, welcome to Parking Live.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Nick, before we get into the industry stuff, I wanted to start with your background because, like a lot of us in parking, it's not really the direct route, right? It's not obvious. You came from aerospace. How does someone go from the aerospace industry to parking? And what did you bring? Did that enable you to understand parking maybe better from an outsider's perspective when you got here?
So I guess answering your question in reverse, no. It definitely didn't. Parking is one of those, it's an interesting industry, right? It's not rocket science, but it is definitely specialized and niche. And to come into this industry, it doesn't matter what year you came in, whether it was in the 1990s, the 2000s, or now in the more modern 2020s, there's no jumping into this without drinking through a fire hose. It doesn't matter what your background is, what your education is. It is a very niche industry, has been, and probably will continue to be. But yes, I did come from an aerospace background, not specifically in a sense of design and development. I'm no rocket scientist. I was part of, and then it became an owner of an electronic components company, and mostly along the side of hard to find electronic components. So pretty specialized in that regard. And just had that opportunity. I got a phone call from one of the larger companies in this industry asking to find some hard to find sensors and sensor equipment. And that was in 2008-ish, maybe closer to 2009. I managed to actually get those units over to that company. It seemed like it was pretty successful. And over the next couple of years, I continued that business, but I had several other opportunities to work within this industry with great individuals. And by about 2012, I had the opportunity to actually come on board into the industry officially. I had like a foot in by 2008, 2009, but by 2012 is when I was neck deep in it.
That's how we do it, Jade. We get our hooks into the skilled newcomers and we never let go of them.
Once you start in parking, you don't leave. I'm pretty sure that it's like a black hole, I've called it, but it's great. It's one of those things. And Nick, I would have owned the rocket scientist thing all day long if you had even the slightest opportunity to. I mean, I think even working in parking, you almost have to be like a parking scientist. There's so many different niches and elements to it where you need that specialist knowledge to be able to kind of actually get the most out of the industry itself, and also for it to adapt and evolve over the time as well. We've seen so many changes, and that kind of takes us nicely into the next part of the conversation. And you used a phrase before when we were chatting before the interview that the industry was about 10 years late to digital, even in 2008. So when did things actually start to shift, in your opinion? And what was the moment where the old model started to break apart? I mean, we've got examples of 2013, 2015 with the introduction of demand-based pricing and consortium technology partnerships in cities like LA and DC. Is that the kind of time where it started to change, or was there a different period?
I think you're kind of nailing it. I mean, in 2008, 2009, when I first had my feet get wet within this industry, that was the beginning of smartphone technology, right? That was the entry of it. And our industry at that point was nowhere near ready to adopt that. I would say we started to see some real change probably around that 2012 timeframe is when I started to see the first talks of APIs coming to the market and development side of what we do. Some companies were finally getting away from pushing flat files to each other, right? It was about 2012, and that is about 10 years too late if you think about it. And that's really just, you look at the trend of this industry going back to the beginning of time. There's a sense of comfortability in what we create as technology providers. And more so, I would say, from the customer side, municipalities, higher education, operators, a sense of comfortability that if the revenue is flowing, why change it?
What broke that? Was it the pandemic? I think you've said that it forced the industry 10 years forward.
Yeah, I would say very much so. And in fact, during the pandemic is where I went from working on the technology side of this industry. I worked for a handful of companies prior to the pandemic, where I actually got together with a handful of very great, smarter people than myself. And we would have I guess you can call it consortiums. We do these discussions, no different than this on a podcast, but on like Zoom videos, right? Where we would get together, and the whole idea behind these conversations during the pandemic were that we had customers, municipalities, higher education, schools and so forth, operators, venues, and so airports and everybody were they were stuck. They were having issues where a company would, in some cases, go out of business completely during the pandemic, but in many cases they would have outages, they would have issues. They were too antiquated to allow for touchless environments, which was obviously key for the situation that was happening during the pandemic and the outbreak of COVID, and they needed solutions to replace the problems that they were dealing with in that time and very quickly. And we set up these calls as a way to just discuss through those solutions. We didn't really have an idea in mind, but what ended up quickly happening, and this is maybe where my advantage of coming from outside and particularly aerospace and maybe dealing with some other technology companies and other industries was helpful. I was able to start reaching out to companies outside of our industry to look for ways to solve some of these issues. And those companies were definitely in that touchless digital environment, truly cloud hosted environments and so forth. And they were able to come in and fix these problems very quickly. And our industry, a lot of the legacy companies that were at play during that time frame just could not get their resources together, whether it was personnel, whether it was service, whether it was the actual products that they had to solve those issues. And it became compete with what is coming in now and become touchless, become API driven, become cloud hosted environment or else. And that really leapfrogged our industry. I would say within about a 2-3 year period after the pandemic, by 2022, 23, we were somewhat caught up to technology. It was pretty interesting.
You said that your outsider perspective didn't lend any expertise, but I think you're being modest. The idea of being able to go outside the industry and look for solutions, I think, really underscores that skill set. So we come out of this pandemic and we have this whole new generation of companies, and they're built on cloud infrastructure, hopefully, and APIs. And what I find interesting is you don't see, well, there's some disruption occurring, but there's also a lot of acquisition as well, with new entrants getting bought, folded in, and then you get back to that kind of one-stop shop with maybe the threat of becoming an age technology again without any evolution. I want to know what you think about that and about the challenge of vertical integration and whether or not that eschews integrating with specialists and outsiders, and whether you see that vertical consolidation and the way that it keeps asserting itself as being a challenge, and what risks, if any, that creates.
Sure. I agree with you, by the way, off your opening about vertical integration has you fearful. It does for me as well. We see it and it seems to be accelerating at a pretty dramatic pace, I think, in the industry. A lot of outside money making its way in. And yes, I would say that there are definite threats to the customer when there's vertical integration involved, right? We, as an industry, have gone through kind of a wave cycle of one-stop shop. No, we should be diversified. One-stop shop, diversified. And I think we're heading back into that one-stop shop is the way to go mentality. It doesn't mean I agree with it. It's just that's the mentality that the industry is going with. And a lot of that is based on the fact that a lot of these VCs and money coming from outside have decided, well, it's a lot faster to grow and make money if I just buy everything and force them together and tell the end user, well, we could do it all. And the truth be said is, in logically, if you're looking at that, I'm a city and I'm looking at that and I go, well, I can have one contract, technically one person, probably a group of people, but the same people that I'm dealing with at one company to deal with issues. And it feels simple, right? Push of a button, I get everything I need. But in reality, as you've just stated and have been stating, a vertical integration does not mean that the one-stop shop is truly integrated at the level that, let's say, somebody who has created a widget or a solution and then created another widget or solution and connected the two to make a dashboard. Vertical integrations are generally completely disparate systems that have been connected through their own integrated services. And if you assume that those integrated services are as fluid as something that was created in-house, you'd be very wrong. In many of those situations, those companies that have been acquired are legacy systems. They're built on old infrastructure, and maybe they've been modified or somewhat modernized over time to support cloud infrastructure and so forth. But they are legacy systems. I'm going to use a kind of probably a brutal term here. There's somewhat rat nests inside of a lot of these old legacy systems. So if you start connecting rat nest 1 to rat nest 2, you're not rebuilding those rat nests. You're just making them look a little better and connecting them, right? So the logic goes out the window. If I'm a city, you're actually not buying a one-stop shop. You're just buying a consolidated set of completely different solutions that are all wrapped in a nice present that says one-stop shop. And I think that leads to a lot of issues.
That's a good point to highlight as well. For a city's on the receiving end of this, what does that experience actually look like to them compared to what they're being told and what the reality is out their side of this?
So, and we'll probably get to the point of procurement sooner than later, but one of the biggest problems in our industry is an RFP goes out requesting for a particular service or solution or technology to be provided, and maybe it has multiple. Like I need A, B, C, parking enforcement citation processing, I need permitting, and I need mobile payment. Most of these legacy or not legacy, more of these like larger consolidated companies will just simply reply to those RFPs with, yeah, we could do it all. And in theory, or not even theory, I guess in practice, the answer is yes, they can. And the logic behind that is that, well, again, you're going to have one-stop shop that you can press one button. When it really boils down to, though, is just two major issues that come out as one is, as I mentioned, the system's not going to actually operate the way you think it is. So chances are you may end up with a problem with one of those facets of the system. Let's just say it was parking citation processing and it was permitting and mobile payment, and the mobile payment goes down for whatever reason. And not just down, but let's say it goes down with like some form of liability, something that you now as a municipality have to remove this piece because it's a problem. You just contracted for everything. So now you're stuck. You have to make a decision now to remove everything or end up with some kind of consequences tied to that contract. And what we see is a forced stagnation of a lot of these customers in our industry that go, well, it's a lot harder for me now to remove this vendor, even though I don't really think they're great anymore, than it is to bring in new vendors. As of course, the RFP process is very expensive, right? And it just, and at least in other issues within, of course, the procurement cycle as well. But that I guess answering your question, that's one of the biggest issues that I see with this.
I guess I'd add too, like when you've got vertical integration of a startup, the first thing that vertical owner is going to look to do is reduce costs. And how does that impact your R&D? I think that's a fascinating way of looking at it too. I had kind of an epiphany the other day, and as IPMI is approaching, we're seeing a lot of people talk about ecosystems. And in my mind, when you go back to the scientific definition of an ecosystem, it's about diversity, it's about specialists. You've got pollinators, bees, they're really good at doing a job. You've got fungus, it's really good at decomposing material. And these things all work in harmony to create some type of benefit. Maybe that's If it's a forest, maybe it's oxygenation, or if it's a marsh, maybe it's preventing floods. And I think about a vertical stack, and I think that's not really an ecosystem, is it? Is that maybe at best a walled garden, maybe at worst a monoculture? And I wanted to get your thoughts on what that means to the market, to someone who maybe works for a city who's fearful about managing that ecosystem. Should they be handing over the keys like that?
That's a fantastic question. And I would say that it is something that if you go back a couple years, right, when you talk about ecosystems and whether it's from a single entity saying one-stop shop, or you're talking about a more diversified opportunity where you have a lot of integrated companies coming in and provides an ecosystem, there is, I think, an inherent fear that, well, that's a lot to manage, particularly with the thought of having multiple companies involved. There's been a fear in this industry for that for a long time. And the truth is as time has gone on here, especially since the pandemic, the infrastructure that is required for a company to survive in our industry means that they are actually technology ready to actually integrate and be interoperable at a way that was not there before. It doesn't mean that that fear is not valid because yes, there's a lot of companies out there who could provide an integrated service to become part of an ecosystem, but you still may have issues, as we mentioned before, where you have a problem with one of those services and you have to then deal with that. There is a kind of a movement happening in our industry now where, and I don't know really where this is going to end because there's a lot of companies trying to do this, where they're trying to become a layer, just simply a layer. You can hire their services as just a layer to sit on top of this ecosystem, quote unquote, to provide that liaison service, whether that's directly as a customer service liaison in a sense of supporting those services. There's agencies that do that. And then, of course, the technology liaison portion where everything gets fed into a singular dashboard of some sort, sometimes behind an SSO, maybe not all the time, but a singular dashboard provided by one of those players. There's good and bad within that, obviously, right? I think if you found a good third party service provider that can become that layer, that's kind of interesting because they tend to be agnostic. They'll be more supportive, I think, of the goals of you as a customer versus if you were to bring in one of those specific companies that can provide that layer for you, but they're also providing one of those services underneath that layer, and they're also competitive maybe with those other integrated services underneath that layer. I don't think that's bad. It just, I could see how there could be some fear that, oh, well, that company is just going to protect themselves. They're going to knock the others within the ecosystem. But there is a movement happening, I guess is what I'm trying to get at. And I do feel like that's going to simplify the process and make this a little easier. And of course, that brings on the opportunity of things like AI services to make that even easier, which we can definitely talk about too. I did have a rethought. We were talking about the one-stop shop and the threat of what that could be for an end user. I wanted to go back to that for a second as well.
Please, yeah.
The second issue in, let's say if you're a municipality and you've brought on a one-stop shop, that one-stop shop company who's developed an entire platform on the idea of selling this service is, one click, you get it all. As they succeed through the industry, and we've seen this, now you have a reference, they get another city, another city, school, so forth. In order for that company to continue to innovate, they need to feel competition. But if you're a one-stop shop and you've, in a sense, removed the need to really have competition in the environment that you're selling into, what does that do to your innovation? And I think that's a question for the industry. It's something to think about, right? Are you actually continuing to push yourself if you don't have competition?
That's fascinating. And I think it also underscores, is your commitment to OMF CDS and these other open data standards, is it maybe illusory? Because if you're doing it all, why integrate? And if you don't integrate, you're not seeing what's best in the world. And yeah, that's a great point. I do want to just jump in real quick and talk about something you mentioned with that kind of agnostic layer. What I think is interesting there is you look at the different objectives that technology vendors have and the alignment with the city. And I wonder, in your mind, if one of the benefits is that kind of agnostic, deep generalist layer, if you will, gives you someone who advocates maybe more for a city's outcomes like safety and congestion reduction and fairness and, yeah, revenue. That's part of it too. And I'm not saying that a technology stack doesn't do that. And I'm not saying that a specialist doesn't do that, but I know that a specialist technology is really focused on doing that one thing well. And a vertical integrator might align with a city's objectives, but they also have their own objectives. And I could see where maybe there would be some pushback. Like if I make money on, for example, if I'm making money on meter transactions, maybe demand pricing isn't in my best interest because there are going to be fewer transactions. And in my mind, that creates maybe a bit of a conflict. But I wanted to get your thoughts just generally on that layer a bit more.
Sure. And by the way, I agree with you completely, right? And again, we're seeing this in real time across our industry is we have, again, usually a lot of outside money. And if I'm an investor in one of these companies, I don't really care whether the public or the city or the university that's using that technology likes it. I just want to make sure I'm getting a return on my investment, right? And that is a pressure that gets pushed down through the organization and it does not line up with the goals of the industry. And to somewhat segue that is there's been, I would say, and it's maybe my ideology, but there's been a movement that I think is starting to happen in our industry of instead of what's been of the past, right, for the last 50, 60 years of our industry was just let's make revenue, right? That's parking is a moneymaker, revenue, revenue, revenue. That doesn't always align with municipal realities, university realities, and so forth, right? Everybody needs to make money, but obviously to keep these programs up and running. And in some cases, some of these new things like Donald Shoup's ideas of parking districts and having money go back in is fantastic. But there's an interesting, I think, change that's happening is that the consumer, and what I mean by consumer, it could be the student in the campus, it could be the parker parking at a parking lot in the city or an on-street situation and so forth. Maybe somebody pulling into a venue and going to a rock concert, paid for the tickets and so forth, figuring out parking. They've always been left out of our conversations as an industry. And that's going to change, whether we like it or not. It's starting to change already. And if we continue to not listen to that or ignore that rather and push our products because we think we know what's best for the consumer, we're going to lose as a whole. It's kind of going back to the layer idea, right? If you have an agnostic layer that is listening to those situations in real time and can actually help the vendorship that's underneath them in that ecosystem to adopt to those changes and work to make those changes happen, that's valuable. And that's going to come through data and insight, of course, and that's just incredibly valuable. Will we go to that? Will we actually make these changes that need to happen in this industry fast enough? Yet to be seen.
Yeah, and fast change doesn't always happen in this industry. And I think at the moment, we're even at a point where the technology is superseding legislation. And that's been happening for quite some time. It happens in the UK. I'm sure it happens in the US as well. So with the new adoption of AI, for example, I mean, that's rapidly increasing. People within the industry are a bit skeptical of it, and some are taking full advantage of it. And you mentioned a term to me before, AI skinning. What is it, and what's the difference between some of the other ways of using AI and what this is specifically? For the listeners that haven't heard the term before, can you tell us what it is and why that matters?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's, and again, I'm going to preface this. I am not an AI expert. I'm definitely doing my best to become part of this, I guess you call it wave of change. And that's really I think the way to call it is it's a revolution that's hitting us. And whether you like it or not, that cat's out of the bag. It is not going to just simply slightly change our industry and or any industry really. We're talking like this is the airplane being built, right? This is something very, very different. It's going to reshape the way we do everything we do in daily life. Our industry is very good at adopting keywords and putting them into our solutions. And AI skinning, it may sound a little bit blunt, but it's a real term. And what it really means is that if you look at AI and it's where it's come from and where it's going today, most of us see AI and understand AI from the search-like experiences through chatbots, ChatGPT, Gemini, so forth, right? And The power of those services being now adopted into technology providers in our industry means that we're taking data and we're sorting it in faster ways than we've ever done before, usually by a click of a button, which is fantastic. But that is just the surface, the skin of what AI can actually do. When you take data and you sort it through AI to make a nice dashboard or to compile some data for cameras and so forth, you're not really an AI company. So that is, you're putting the skin on saying that, hey, I'm an AI company because I'm using AI. You're using AI. You're not actually building, that's already built. The idea of search and formulaic ideas like that, that's something that's been done for a long time. AI is just making it much more efficient. The next level, which is leapfrogs ahead, and the best way for me to describe it is called agentic. And it's the idea of AI being utilized as an agent, agentic agent. And I think the easiest way for me to explain it is if you were to book a flight in the early 2000s, right? You wanted to go to Paris, France. Chances are, and already Google was around, right? So you would use a search engine, search for your flight. You would then have to go and figure out your rental car situation. You would use the search engine, you could get your rental car, hotel, so forth, but bus, train, whatever you were going to do. It was all disparate. It was really painful. Or you would hire a travel agent, right? As we get kind of further into the 2000s, we had some of these compiling websites that would take some of this information that you could provide it, and it would provide you some form of solution of hotel, airplane, so forth, right? Again, simple idea similar to AI. If you step AI into that, and especially these search bot level AI solutions, it would be like if you were to go to ChatGPT and tell it you want to go to France in 2 weeks, right? It would build your itinerary for you. It kind of knows you. It can do some searches on what's going on in Paris, France, maybe give you some things that you can go do, but it's not going to do much more than that, right? You still have this manual piece that you have to drive into it without having to write code. Agentic is when I say leapfrog, it's completely different. In an agentic environment, I want to go to Paris in 2 weeks, and I tell it I'm going to Paris in 2 weeks. It will determine and purchase my flight. It will know that I like to sit by the window in business class. Will make sure that I can sit by the window in business class. If it can't find the seat in business class with window, maybe a week later, a seat opens up. It will automatically book that seat and cancel the first one for me. It will automatically book my hotel, my rental car. It knows I like my pillows fluffy in the hotel, maybe an extra pillow, what floor I like to be on near the elevator. It knows all this, and it's going to keep changing things for me as it goes. It might ask a couple questions here and there, right, just to make sure, but it's going to do it all for me. Now, you're going to Paris, France. Let's just say for some reason the weather changes and the event that you're going to, maybe it's a tennis match, I'm just making this up, of course, gets canceled. It will automatically cancel your flights, your rentals, your hotels, everything. Make sure you get all your discounts and refunds back. And it will smile and walk away from you. That is agentic. It is leapfrogs ahead of what we're talking about when we're talking about AI in our current industry, right? We're talking about literally push of the button, change complete environments. And there is a company that I already know of that's working on this in this industry. And the companies that actually bring true agentic in, that's the future. That's what I mean by this industry is not going to look the same in the next 5, 10 years. It is completely going to change. And it's the legacy companies that are still trying to consolidate and push and be manually driven. You're in trouble if you don't make the change.
You know, Nick, you left out that agentic would have also given you like a tour of really good parking spaces,
Yes.
like where really interesting parking kiosks are. Like I'm that freak whenever I go to a city, I'm taking picture of parking signs
Oh my
and
gosh.
yeah.
I purposely left parking out because I don't want to obviously insult anybody on how powerful agentic can be for parking. And there's a lot of fear, as you said, Jade, right, in this industry about what it can, it can't do. A lot of people, again, use the basis of what they understand of AI, search engine based principles of AI. And we actually put a poll out on LinkedIn just a few days ago, and it's 30, 35 responses already. And the vast majority of people, biggest fear is that AI is going to make mistakes. It was really interesting to see that. It was not the privacy issue, which you would think, I think logically most people go straight to, oh, AI is going to break privacy. Privacy is broken in many other places. AI is just might make it worse, right? But the reality is that if you think agentic is going to make mistakes, you might actually be wrong. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to take full set. Like AI can make mistakes. We've seen it do it, but agentic doesn't really look at the same solutions. And this is something I forgot to mention. When you look at agentic and you look at how it actually processes the information it's using, it's not going to use the search engine tools, social medias and Reddits of the world to process and pull information. It's a specialist. It's only going to pull what you want it to pull. And it's programmed in a way to be surrounding only that. So if we were to move agentic into parking, it's not going to look at Facebook and look for answers. It's going to look at the real realities of what we feed it. So if we're worried that it's going to make mistakes, that means we made mistakes when we fed it, right? So what does that say, right? So we shouldn't be so worried about the mistakes it's going to make. What we need to do is work with it to evolve it, to make sure that it's going to make the least amount of mistakes possible, and that we can correct those mistakes quickly. And Agentic's smart enough that if you just simply tell it that was a mistake, it will work very quickly to solve it in real time.
That's interesting because you're really moving beyond that deterministic view of AI. Let's say I'm government, right? I am a city's parking manager, or I am maybe their procurement office, and a company comes in and they say, "Hey, I am an AI parking company." Are there questions aside from the agentic aspects that maybe I should be asking them to find out if it's real? Because most of the procurement frameworks, they're not set up to even evaluate a vendor structure, let alone this very nascent thing called AI.
That's a rabbit hole when you start talking about procurement in this industry. One of the things that actually Heather Matthews, my counterpart, wrote a really good article not too long ago about procurement and the idea of removing the RFP as a whole from our services as an industry. And I agree. We could talk about that and how that segues into your question a little bit here. It's kind of an ongoing known secret in our industry that when an RFP is published, somebody's already been picked. It's just a formality. So, just fill out the blanks and see if you get lucky. But chances are it's already been. And unfortunately, there's some truth to this, right? I've seen it enough. I think all of us can agree to that. I hate to be that blunt about it, but it's relatively true. And I hope that the municipalities and so forth that are listening to this podcast hear that. The truth is that the RFP process is outdated. It's not designed to support innovative technology and change. It's designed to support safety and the mechanisms within the environment of the customer, and as well as, of course, some liability. But there's been a decent amount of change within the RFP process that's happening. And one of those things that I would like to highlight and which can allow for, let's say, a municipality to ask the right questions and test the right environments for things like this. Can't be done everywhere. It would require some legislative change, is to put out RFIs, which is a great way to just simply get information of who's out there and what they can do, and put some actual action into those RFIs, such as pilot programs. Test out the darn things that you want to use. Put it in environments that are realistic and difficult and are going to test your team and the environments they're working in on a daily basis. And then set up those top 3 vendors that maybe brought multiple diversified technologies to your RFI, because RFIs are not locking you into a scope that becomes outdated by the time the RFP is out. RFIs can change, and make some decisions on how you can actually build those products into your actual services and solution as, let's say, a city. This changes the way you maybe approach something like AI. In the current marketplace, you would have to ask a lot of questions and hope that the vendor is going to just simply tell you the truth. Let's be real. They're simply going to tell you they can do everything. We all do. And if you're saying otherwise, you're lying. Like, we all do that. I did it when I was a vendor. The technology companies I represented, we just checked those boxes. Yep, 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 yep. And then we get to the end of the RFP and we win and we're like, yeah, we could do 80% of that. We'll build the others. And by then you're locked in, so you got it anyway, right? Because they're not going to redo the RFP process at that point. So with AI, you don't really have an opportunity to test it unless you're going to actually test it, right? And so if somebody's telling you they're going to utilize AI to build those services, first of all, have them show you. Not in a sandbox. Show you the real thing working in a real environment, right? I tell every municipality that I work with that if they can't show it to you, it's not real. Like, you have to believe it. Secondly, for procurement offices, one of the things that is starting to happen maybe more than it used to is you should have some form of consequence to those vendors who claim to do something and not bring it and not lock yourself into something that now you're stuck with for a long time. I know I kind of answered your question in like 5 different ways, but unfortunately, it's not as simple as saying, hey, just show me with AI. Because if we're talking about agentic particularly, it has to be built around you. It's not something you could just click a search engine and get something going, right? It's very different.
This AI conversation fascinates me. And you, as you were talking there, you mentioned companies that are using AI to build AI. So not as a product feature, but as an entire development model. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that actually looks like in practice? Because that kind of just, even the statement blew my mind a little bit. Because I think most of our listeners have heard the theory, but not really what it looks like in practice.
Absolutely. So for those who understand development and the cycles of development, right, you usually have a product and you do a run, right? And you get a certain amount done and maybe get an MVP and so forth. And these teams usually are large, especially for the larger companies, right? We're talking sometimes a dozen individuals or more. Sometimes it's outsourced to a different country and it can be even bigger than that, right? And you're building out these development tools. And maybe that is, I'm going to add a feature to my citation processing environment, right? I'm going to, whatever it might be. Within the new environments of AI, you can build out an agent to handle the rudimentary writing of code. And it actually will make less mistakes than people because it's code and it's built from code. It knows code pretty well. And you could then tell it, if you need to build this other piece and you stumble, just create another agent while you're at it. So the AI will just keep building agents and it will build your code for you while you just simply build the map in a sense, right? Usually you need a team to do this and you need time quite a bit. And again, I'm relatively just tapping into this. So I apologize for even my lack of understanding of it. But we've done this because we work with a couple of technology companies where we've literally, they come to us, hey, check out this thing. And I'm like, that's great. But in parking, you need to remove all this and change all that, right? And as we all know, parking's very, very niche. And you go back 10 years, and if I told this to a company, they'd be like, yeah, we're going out of business. Like, forget it. We're not going to develop that. That's going to cost us, I don't know, 6, 7 figures, right? Forget it. Today, it's like, okay. And then like 24 hours later, I get a call, hey, we did it. You want to see it? Like, unbelievable. And I asked him, like, how did you do this? Oh, I used AI. And it's seamless. It works great, right? I mean, that's extremely powerful. And yeah, that's, that's one of the biggest fears of AI, which amazingly on my poll is kind of on the lower end, is jobs. What does this mean for jobs? And we can go down that rabbit hole separately, but that's definitely something to consider.
You know what? As I was learning about AI and using it more, just in my even day-to-day life, let alone in my work environment, I found myself asking it how to use it. So I was using it to teach me how to use it. And then eventually I got it to start doing the things I wanted it to do itself. So it's that involvement, but just on a larger scale, isn't it? And it's so exciting. I know the listeners can't see us because we're on an audio podcast, but Matt and I are grinning and nodding as Nick was talking just then, because this is such an exciting prospect that can really accelerate where the industry goes. I just hope that the legislation then tries to catch up to keep up with it.
We have a whole nother podcast of legislation.
We do. Part 2 for you, Nick.
Absolutely. And to pull that back to procurement, I mean, I've had an opportunity to read some of your thought leadership pieces, and I'm a huge fan of ensuring tech and policy intersect. Your discussion of the RFI process, is that a way to reshape procurements to ensure that alignment between technology and policy objectives? Or are there other ideas that you have in that regard?
I mean, I have plenty of ideas. I think that's the only one that comes to mind when I think about maybe doing it in the interim, right? Because it somewhat follows the flow of what we've been doing for a long time. And if we're talking particularly about municipalities, it's very difficult to make the changes, even if legislation changes, simply to the status quo, how things have been done in the step 1 to step 2 to step 3, so forth, right? I do believe that there's a future in which we could change the way we actually go to procurement completely, right? I actually have not had a whole lot of examples maybe I could bring to the table yet of how that maybe could be done. But I look at the opposite. I think there's a lot you could say about what has been done and maybe shouldn't have been done, and or what lessons we've learned from things that don't work. One of the things that, going back to my aerospace days in procurement, is one of the reasons why I actually left aerospace, as well as obviously loved coming into parking, was that during the 2009, the recession, particularly, aerospace took a very, very big hit during that. Particularly me in the Los Angeles area, the layoffs and the destruction of the aerospace industry out here was terrible. And one of the things that ended up happening is, instead of going into the future and understanding how to do procurement, they consolidated procurement into these supply chains where you have to go through prime vendors. So in a sense, like, the biggest legacy companies now all of a sudden are the only ones that can actually work with the aerospace agencies. That is the wrong way. That absolutely devastated the free market of aerospace completely, and probably a lot of the innovation that goes into it. And I will speak to that to the day I die. But what I'm fearful in our industry is something similar. As we continue to have these consolidations and these changes, we don't want to simplify procurement by just going to the big guys. I can tell you that. That's for sure. In terms of answering it, like, what's the right way to do this moving forward? I think that's going to be for the next podcast for sure. I got to definitely put some thought to that.
That's great. Well, we'll book that one for sure.
When we are looking at this vertically integrated stacks by larger parking companies, what does it look like when the wrong things happen? What can go wrong in this kind of situation, and what is the impact of that?
A lot.
A whole other podcast, guys.
I think that the first and foremost, and we did touch on this before, is that these companies, when they become big enough, they may be vertically integrated, but that doesn't mean leadership's vertically thinking, nor does it mean that there's any real opportunity for innovation to make its way into decisions. It's also very likely, and I just literally wrote an article about this, that in these larger vertically integrated companies, that you have vacuums of information. And what I mean by that is not so much that, oh, leadership is not getting to me, because leadership's going to be pushing and pushing and pushing information. We know this. It's the other way around. The customer's complaining, a salesperson's dealing with that complaint, or account manager's dealing with that complaint. They go to their manager, who then needs to go to their manager, and manager. And the problem is that gets lost by the time it gets to really anybody who can make decisions on some kind of change, whether that's innovation, R&D, maybe it's even customer service. So what we start to see is a continuous degradation of the company. Slowly, cracks start forming, and then those cracks become bigger. And all the meantime, the pressure increases because the stakeholders are wanting revenue. They want growth. So now these cracks start forming, and this company is maybe stagnating a bit. So they have more pressure to do even more coming down, and nobody's listening on the other way up. And so we've seen this in the industry before. Growth, implosion. And unfortunately, that cycle is so historically accurate that it's almost predictable at this point. If you're a customer, that's not great news for you.
No, that top-down pressure almost it certainly dilutes the quality that people are getting, that cities and authorities are getting for the value that they're paying for. So yeah, that's a really interesting point, actually. I did have a conversation many, many years ago when there was a boom in mobile payment vendors popping up everywhere. And it was that in particular because it ended up becoming a race to the bottom in terms of costs. You know, who could do the most for the less costs to try and, win that business in a price point situation. But each time that happened, it put more and more pressure on those businesses to produce something that was of high quality for very little in terms of cost. So that put extra pressure on them. Businesses went out of business because of that race to the bottom.
Yes.
So yeah, it's an extremely important point to highlight. I had one last question for you, Nick, just to kind of wrap it off a little bit. And we were talking about the interoperable ecosystem earlier. And the question that popped into my mind was, how important are data standardizations like APDS and the curbside data standard, the CDS as well? How important are those standards when we're trying to evolve these interoperable ecosystems as we grow?
Critical, not just critical, hypercritical. When you talk about, particularly here in the States, right? The states don't really talk to each other. Cities definitely don't talk to each other. particularly in parking outside of maybe a couple trade shows here and there, where there's not a lot of constant conversation about, hey, I'm doing this, check this out. And particularly when it comes to the actual technology stacks and the way that they could potentially communicate, we don't really have any other way to make sure that these things, these incredibly disparate systems and disparate society in many ways, work together. Having some form of standard so that systems can communicate no matter where they are operating in, whether it's a city, whatever it is, wherever it is very, very important. And going again off lessons that we should be learn many, many times over in this industry is, and where things go awfully wrong often, is a vendor is on its way out of a municipality, for instance, and needs to, let's say, integrate their old data into, or merge their old data into the new vendor coming in. There is not a lot of standard there, right? Usually it's some form of contract that says you need to do it in an Excel sheet, at probably best, right? It's terrible. And it leads to a lot of complications and delays, and sometimes worse, right? So having standards putting that occur, which is kind of a new and an innovative part of our industry as it's starting to really, really progress, to prevent you as a consumer driving into a city and then maybe going to another city. You want things to feel and look the same. We don't know when we're crossing the boundaries of cities, right? When you're driving, you're just crossing the boundaries of cities. And why would you have to have a major change between one to the other?
Yeah, I mean, the conversation of costly mistakes as well when it comes to trying to integrate with services that are speaking different languages, technically, and errors can happen. The connections can be costly as well. And having that kind of almost one language that everything speaks makes that a whole lot easier to, one, for the authorities to be able to pick the partners that they need and would like to kind of move on with, but also gives them the flexibility to not be ring-fenced to certain providers that can interact with each other as well. So yeah, that's a great point. And thanks. And look, Nick, this has been like exactly the kind of conversation that this show exists for as well. The industry talks a lot about technology and conversations that get underneath it, to the structure, the incentives, the decisions, the initiatives that happen behind it, and the outcomes that actually shape cities as well. So what is rarer is actually getting into the nitty-gritty of it like we have done today, and what you've described today as well in terms of the risks to authorities, the opportunity as well, not just to authorities, but to businesses that are working within the industry. Exactly the kind of clarity that I hope our listeners take on board from this particular episode. So thank you. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. And I think there's about 2 other episodes that we can record with you as well on completely different subjects.
Yeah, this is apparently going to be an iterative podcast. To just echo what Jade said, thank you so much for your time and your frankness and directness. You're going to be in Milwaukee at IPMI?
I will be, absolutely, yes.
Awesome. All right, we're very much looking forward to catching up with you there as well.
Thank you both. This was a lot of fun, and I'm definitely up for series 2 and 3.
Oh, well, trust me, you're invited.
Yeah, I think we'll just have to have a seasonal spot for Nick.
Yeah. And Matt, I heard you mention fungus. I think that's the second time in our 2 seasons that you've mentioned some kind of fungus. So I'm going to do a collation towards the end of the season where we can just pick out the bits where you've managed to drop that in somehow in the conversation randomly.
Yeah, it's weird how I'm working that in.
Yeah. So, is it a dare? I've loved this conversation, and to everyone listening, thank you for joining us. If you want to go deeper into the structural arguments we've circled today, the link to the Beyond One Vendor series, which has also been wrote by our co-host Matt Darst, is going to be in the show notes and also covers some of these points as well. The accountability gap, vendor consolidation, and what cities should actually be asking before they sign on the dotted line. We'll be back soon. Thanks for being here. Until next time, thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening. I'm Julie Gates, executive producer of Parking Live. This episode was created by hosts and producers Jade, Neville, and Matt Darst, producer Chris O'Keefe, editor Patrick Emile, and associate producer Cindy Raskin. Parking Live is brought to you by Modaxo, passionate about moving the world's people. You can follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and visit us online at parking-live.com. Thanks for joining us at Parking Live, where the curb meets the conversation.